What is going on, guys? My name is John and welcome back to yet another video. As of the day this video goes up, it's almost been a year since I completed my very first Professor Oak challenge in Pokemon Red and Blue. Ever since I released the catch-em-all for the most recent games, a majority of you have been asking for me to take on the 8th generation. And today we're going to do just that. Today we're going to find out how easily you can complete Professor Oak's challenge in Pokemon Sword and Shield. So if you have no idea what this video is about, or specifically what a Professor Oak challenge is, I've included a playlist so you can check out in the top right of your screen to better understand what this is all about. As always, I'd highly suggest checking them out first, but regardless, let's go over the rules and see what we're up against. The first and most important rule of this challenge is that you have to catch every Pokemon that's available before each gym leader that you face. This sounds relatively easy, but I'm sure your opinions will change quickly in about 5 minutes. The second rule is that you can only use one copy of the game. I chose to play through Shield, which means that Sword's version exclusives, trade evolutions, and the other 2 sets of starters won't be available. But don't worry, there are going to be a lot of Pokemon available to catch. Now normally the final unspoken rule is that no glitches can be used, but we're going to talk about exploits later on once they come into play throughout the story. I also want to give a preemptive shout out to Sean Angle 81, who I believe came up with the first guide for Sword and Shield, and a large portion of the spreadsheet I used is referenced from him. I've linked the original Reddit post in the description, but if you prefer the normal Google spreadsheets that I make, that will also be linked in the description as well. Without further ado, let's just get right into it. Now if you've played Pokemon Sword and Shield, you probably have a relatively good idea of how this video is going to progress, and all I have to say is that this game is quite an interesting experience. Although there are currently 400 Pokemon available in the game before any of the DLCs are going to be released, this is going to be far from an easy task. I know some people might mention that I didn't catch specific Pokemon that weren't in the base game down the road, so if you're watching this in the future, this is only going to be based around the original copies of Pokemon Sword and Shield. So per usual, we start out the game like any other playthrough of Pokemon Sword and Shield. We meet our rival Hop and make our way through the brief tutorials, before meeting Leon at the Wedgehurst station. Once we go back to their house, we're able to choose the starter that we like to carry throughout the rest of our adventure. Now for the first time ever in this challenge, we're able to pick any of the starters that are available. Normally the Pokemon level up to their final forms between the ranges of 32 and 36, but this time around they all finish evolving at level 35. There isn't necessarily a superior choice out of the 3, so I just chose Scorbunny because I feel like he gets the least amount of love. From here we head into the Slumbering Weald and meet up with a mysterious legendary Pokemon, and after a very quick intro section, we're ready to start catching some Pokemon. As you'd expect, Route 1 is the first location that we can get encounters, and we're already going to have to spend a little bit of time finding a bunch of Pokemon, as there are Pokemon available in the overworld, as well as hidden encounters in the shaking grass. Typically, these grass encounters are drastically different than the Pokemon that you see walking around, so most routes will have double the normal encounters that you'd usually have to get in this type of challenge. On our way to Wedgehurst, I managed to catch Rookidee, Wooloo, Caterpie, and Blipbug, which starts us out strong with a solid 5 Pokemon. Once we meet up with Sonia at the lab, we're given the Pokedex and are instructed to visit Professor Magnolia at her house at the end of Route 2. If we head in that direction, we're given more Pokeballs from Leon, which will surely not go to waste across the next couple of areas. Route 2 has a bunch of new additions that are realistically better to obtain later on because of the higher level advantage, but there are still some important ones to grab, including some fishing encounters, as we're given the fishing rod right at the beginning of the game. Here we can catch Nickit, Choodle, Magikarp, and Arrokuda. Once we clear through all the trainers, we can meet Professor Magnolia, battle Hop once again, and collect our endorsement letter so we can take on the Pokemon League Challenge. Once the next day rolls around, we're told to head back to Wedgehurst Station to take the train to the first city. Per usual, a group of Wooloo block our path, which forces us to take the long way through the wild area. Now if you know anything about Pokemon Sword and Shield, you know that the wild area is not only the largest area in any mainline Pokemon game, but it's also crawling with many Pokemon. I'm sure you're probably starting to visually imagine the sheer mass of Pokemon that are required for this section now, but in the interest of not making this video a scattered mess of encounters, we're going to just finish what we can before we even touch a single Pokemon that's available here. Our next stop is going to be Motostoke, where we have a bunch of storyline events that we have to take care of. We learn about the history of the Galar region before meeting Marnie, and then we register for the gym challenge and meet a ton of important characters that we'll talk more about throughout the story. Before we head into the next route, we're going to take care of a little bit of fishing, which brings me to talk about something very interesting that I discovered. So according to every website that covers Sword and Shield, Barboach is available at any of the fishing locations available within Motostoke. I decided to just fish at the far left of the water by the train station, and I went through easily 75 encounters before I had to look online and see what the issue was. Apparently I wasn't the only one, and a decent amount of people have mentioned that some Pokemon just straight up don't appear, and if they do, it's after an absurd amount of encounters. Now I know some of you might say that I was just extremely unlucky, but Barboach is supposed to be a 10% encounter rate no matter where you are in the city. The odds of not finding one after that many encounters is almost statistically impossible, and apparently a lot of other people have been having this issue. There is a Pokemon that's a lot more infamous for this issue that I'll cover later on, but if you happen to be following along, just fish at this location instead because I found one after like 4 encounters. As we're exiting the west side of the city, we have to take on Hop again. After the battle, Blipbug evolved into Dottler. As you'd expect, Route 3 contains a bunch of new Pokemon, but if you prefer to get them later, a majority of them are available in different locations. Here we can get Stunky, Zigzagoon, Gossifleur, Growlithe, Trubbish, Pancham, Machop, Sizzlipede, Mudbray, and Clink. But our Scorbunny also evolved into Raboot with all the XP that you earn from catching them. After skipping a bunch of trainers, we can enter the Galar Mine for another decent chunk of this section. With all the overworld encounters, we can catch Woobat, Roly-Coly, Timber, Roggenrola, Drillbur, and Diglett, before taking on Beat at the end of the cave. At this point, you have the option of heading to the next route, but if you want to save a little bit of time, you can re-enter the cave and follow the railroad tracks to be able to catch a wild Carkol, which will help with the leveling process later on. Route 4 is the last normal section that we have to take care of, and although this is one of the shortest routes, almost every encounter is a brand new Pokemon. Through the overworld and grass, we can catch Electrike, Pumpkaboo, Meowth, Yamper, Eevee, Joltik, Ferroseed, Cutiefly, Milcery, Badoo, and Fish for Goldeen, which gives us a whopping 40 Pokemon. Upon reaching Turffield, we meet our first gym leader Milo, and we talk to Hop and Sonia about the hill drawings, before being told that we should challenge our first gym leader. Although we're going to avoid this area for quite a while, it's important to trade one of those Galarian Meowths that we caught in the gym for a Cantonian one. These Pokemon don't have an additional dex entry because it's technically still a Meowth, but its evolution will, so it's important not to pass this one up. If we try and head towards Route 5, we're completely blocked off until we can claim the badge, so we should probably start leveling up our catches, right? Not exactly. Now it's time to talk about the one thing you probably came here for. The Wild Area. The Wild Area is by far the most notable part of Generation 8, as it expanded the way that you can encounter Pokemon, to the point where you can stumble upon level 60 Pokemon without having a single gym badge. This location contains many different sub-locations, which each contain an almost completely different variety of Pokemon. And to top it all off, the encounters change daily as almost all the Pokemon are based around different weather patterns. Static Pokemon roam the overworld in each section, which are probably the most interesting feature considering a lot of them are special forms like item or trait evolutions. Although all these play a big part in the catching total for this section, the main attraction of the wild area are the max raid battles. These small stone dens each contain a wide selection of Pokemon available to challenge in almost the same way as you'd take on raids in Pokemon Go. The dens will continuously generate as you complete them, but if there's a specific Pokemon that you're looking for, you can purchase wishing pieces with the raid battle currency that you earn to essentially summon your own raids. Now that I've caught you up, let's talk about something a tad bit controversial: the raid den exploit. If you haven't realized by now, the wild area contains an overwhelmingly large amount of the encounters for this section, and a very large of that is solely from max raid battles. Now normally I'm against doing anything that's heavily considered an exploit, but let me explain a couple things before I go any further. Like I mentioned earlier, each den contains a set of Pokemon, and just like regular encounters, each Pokemon has a percentage of appearing as a raid encounter. In addition, each den actually contains 2 separate dens: common dens, which are represented by a red beam, and rare dens, which are represented by an almost bright purple looking beam. Every time a den is generated, there is a 10% chance that the den will become a rare den, which houses probably 60% of the encounters that have to be collected through raids. Initially, as you go through every den that's randomly generated, you're going to probably have very few repeat encounters, but that number increases exponentially every time a new batch spawns. Every batch will probably have 2 rare beams at most, and the only way to get a new batch of dens is to either wait until the next day rolls over, summon your own, or defeat every den that's currently available. This process can take up to 20 minutes per batch, which means if you're only missing one Pokemon that's available in one specific den, you're going to be spending arguably days waiting for that one last Pokemon to appear. I know some of you might say, well, why don't you just summon a raid at the den that you need? And while that's totally possible, the wishing pieces cost 3,000 watts a piece, and once you throw it in the den, you get whatever it gives you. Although 3,000 might not seem like much, until you beat the entire storyline, you only get 300 watts per active den. This means you'll be able to afford a wishing piece once every 10 raids, which is equivalent to about 20 to 25 minutes depending on how well equipped your Pokemon are. To put it into a better perspective, let's use an example. In this den, Carablast has a 20% encounter rate within only the rare dens. This Pokemon isn't obtainable at a catchable level anywhere but in the dens at this point in the game, which means that every time a wishing piece is thrown in the den, you have a 10% chance for a rare beam, and a 20% chance for the Carablast to appear. That's a 2% chance every time for a relatively common den encounter. Considering the beams don't reactivate every den once you complete a batch, you could be running through dens for days on end and not get the Pokemon that you want. A little while after the game was released, there was an exploit discovered that allowed you to throw a wishing piece in the den, and essentially you could re-roll the encounter that was available in the den. This is done by changing your Switch's clock, and essentially with this method you can guarantee an encounter for any Pokemon you want for each wishing piece that you use. Now that I've caught you up, I will say that I did use this method to obtain all the Pokemon for this section. And while I know that some people might not necessarily like that, I don't really think that this mechanic is necessarily game-breaking for a challenge like this. Although you get a ton of watts for doing this, there isn't really any major benefit aside from getting more wishing pieces. The only thing that this really does is make it so you don't have to wait 3 days to catch a single Sinistee, and I see it in the same realm as changing your clock to get Pokemon in specific weather patterns, or evolve a Pokemon that only evolves during a certain time of the day. On the other hand, this exploit can also be used to finish Pokejobs instantly, which will give you a lot of experience, which is definitely cheating in my eyes. Once again, I know that some people might not be crazy about this, but considering that I've changed the clock in every previous video to catch specific Pokemon, instead of waiting until it was actually nighttime, I figured that it wouldn't be too different considering that this is also a major exploit to the game. Okay, now that I've given my long-winded explanation, let's start catching some Pokemon. Starting from the original entrance to the wild area, our first location is going to be the Rolling Fields. This location contains the most encounters from changing weather, as well as raid dens, so this area will probably take the longest time to complete out of the entire wild area. Through the standard encounters, we can catch Skwovet, Cherubi, Tyrogue, Bunnelby, Combee, Bounsweet, Minccino, Pidove, Ralts, Two Oddish, Wingull, Vanillite, Swinub, Pikachu, and Baltoy. As for raid encounters, we can catch Cleffa, Spritzee, Morlul, Impidimp, Binacle, Bonsley, Wimpod, Shelmet, Dewpider, Natu, Vullaby, Yamask, Axew, Noibat, Trapinch, Goomy, Applin, Krogunk, and Riolu. Heading north of this area, we can visit the Dabble Grove, which has way less raid encounters, but they're still very important to not forget. For general encounters, we can catch Stuffle, Hoot Hoot, Timpole, Lotad, Grubbin, Delibird, and Snover, while the only two raid Pokemon for this area are going to be Cottony and Phantump, which brings us to 83 Pokemon. As we're heading towards the entrance to Motostoke, we can pass by the Watchtower Ruins. Now, since we don't have any badges yet, we're only allowed to catch Pokemon as high as level 20, and since all the Pokemon here are borderline level 30, it seems like the only catches here would be the raids, right? Oddly enough, the random grass encounters are actually catchable, which means that almost all these overworld Pokemon are still obtainable. Here we can catch Golett, Drifloon, Ghastly, and Duskull. And for the raid battles, we can catch Munna, Esper, Solosis, Elgyem, Inkay, Mr. Mime, Honedge, Frillish, and Sinistee. In the lower half of the wild area, there are two lakes available, Lake Axwell and Lake Mylock. Each area has different Pokemon depending on what side of the lake you're on, which results in a very large chunk of encounters. On the west side of Lake Axwell, we can catch two Remoraid, Wishiwashi, Krabby, Wooper, Dwebble, and encounter Sneasel as a raid. As for the east side, we can catch Shelder, Snorunt, and Onix within the grass, and Skorupi and Coughing through the raids. At Lake Mylock, we can catch Basculin and Clobopus in the north side of the water, and at the southern half, we can catch Pukamuku, Corfish, and Nincada. Between these two sides of the lake is the Giant Seat. Because this area has Pokemon around the same level as the Watchtower Ruins, only the raid Pokemon are going to be available. With this, we can get Bronzor, Pawniard, Cubchoo, and Bergmite, which gives us a ridiculous 116 Pokemon, and we haven't even collected the first badge. Now, some of you are probably thinking that this is the final area, which means that all we have to do now is level up our catches. And for those horrible few that think that this isn't enough, you're in luck. Although they don't mention this at all throughout the story, you can actually access all but 2 locations in the wild area at this point. I don't think they necessarily intended for many players to cross the bridge because of how much higher level the encounters are, but if you can dodge the overworld spawns, you can interact with all the dens in the area, which adds quite a hefty list of mons that are pretty easy to overlook. Starting at the Motostoke Riverbank, we can catch Munchlax, Chinchou, Toxel, Wynot, and Mime Jr. And at Bridgefield, we can catch Hatenna, Togepi, and Ponyta. The last chunk of raids are all in the northern section of the wild area, which includes the Stony Wilderness, Giant's Mirror, Hammerlock Hills, and the Dusty Bowl. This allows us to do raids for Ditto, Salandit, Litwick, Helioptile, Charmander, Snom, Silicobra, and Hippopotas. Now, because we're able to access this area, this means we can also breed Pokemon in the Daycare Center, as well as collect the evolution stones and the fossils from the Digging Duo. During this process, you're going to be obtaining a large amount of items that sell for a high price. So if you're running out of money for Pokeballs at any point, it doesn't hurt to spend a little bit of watts to get you back on your feet. Before we get to breeding, we have to go back to Route 2, as I forgot to catch Purloin, which is only available in the fog weather in the wild area, which isn't available until you beat the game. After running around to hatch eggs, which is way more tedious when you don't have a bike if you're wondering, we were able to get 7 Eevee, Ralts, Pichu, Snorunt, and a female Salandit, giving us a grand total of 134 Pokemon. Yikes. But as you all know, this doesn't mean that we have all the Pokemon before the first badge. We still need to level up our catches. So it's probably no surprise that this section is the longest out of the entire game. I mean, we have over a third of the decks and we've only evolved like 2 Pokemon so far, so this is quite an experience to say the least. Now, although I said I picked Scorbunny because no one seemed to love him because he looks like Incineroar's cousin, I actually chose him because I thought it would help with the grinding section. My initial plan was to use a lot of the EXP candies I earned from all the raids to evolve into Cinderace, and then battle Pokemon in the northern section during the winter weather. With this, I could train 5 Pokemon at a time, and realistically this could be faster than doing raids and collecting experience candies. Now, starting out, this actually worked out pretty well, as most of the Pokemon I was training were super low level, so they were gaining like 500 XP per battle, which is significantly faster than doing the raids. For every 1-star raid that you complete, you earn 1 small EXP candy and 5 extra small EXP candies, which total to 1300 experience for every common raid that you do. Considering that my whole team was earning 500 XP at once, it seemed like a no-brainer that I should just grind to complete this as fast as I could. However, as my Pokemon made it into the mid-20s, the experience curve started to spike to the point where my Pokemon were only earning about 100 per battle. I searched online for the highest EXP yielding Pokemon, and I was battling what I assumed to be the best option. But after a few hours of grinding, I realized that since some of these Pokemon evolve as high as level 50, it would be way more optimal to just run through raids over and over until I've amassed all the EXP candies I need to level up. Another major benefit to doing the raids is that after every raid you have a 25% chance of getting a rare candy, which makes Pokemon like Klinklang much easier when they need to earn upwards of 8,000 experience per level. If you want to be as optimal as you could possibly be, the best way to level up would be to get all your catches to around 20 to 25, and then use the experience candies on all of them to take care of the rest. It would definitely be much more tedious, but I'm sure that you could shave off a solid 6 hours or so from spending a few hours taking care of that. Now, I'm sure you're probably wondering about the shinies that I collected on this adventure, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but this game has probably the lowest chance of encountering shinies out of any of the games. Except for, you know, red and blue. Although I was running through a bunch of wild encounters for the beginning section of the grinding, the game is coded for high level encounters to not be shiny, as it'd be pretty annoying to find a shiny that you couldn't catch just because the game refuses to let you throw a ball at it. This means that the only way you could find a shiny is through the raids, which as far as I know aren't increased odds, and are still the 1 in 4096 they've been since Generation 6. Or while you're collecting Pokemon, you need to evolve like we did earlier. Now that we're done explaining everything, let's go over every evolution that I had to get. This is going to take a pretty long time, and just like the Diamond and Pearl Professor Oak challenge, we're going to do this in one take. After all of our catches, I was able to evolve them to get Cinderace, Corvisquire, Corviknight, Thievul, Metapod, Butterfree, Gyarados, Dreadnought, Dubwool, Eldegoss, Arcanine, Barraskewda, Orbeetle, Linoone, Whiscash, Machoke, Skuntank, Obstagoon, Garbodor, Mudsdale, Boldore, Pangoro, Dugtrio, Girder, Colossal, Excadrill, Manectric, Berserker, Boltund, Ribombee, Clang, Klinklang, Persian, Seaking, Galvantula, Flareon, Jolteon, Vaporeon, Leafeon, Glaceon, Cheerum, Greedent, Vespiquen, Diggersby, Hitmonlee, Hitmonchan, Hitmontop, Cinccino, Steenie, Serena, Tranquil, Unpheasant, Kirlia, Gardevoir, Gallade, Gloom, Vileplume, Bellossom, Pelipper, Vanillish, Vanillux, Piloswine, Mamoswine, Raichu, Claydol, Shiinotic, Morgrem, Grimmsnarl, Sudowoodo, Barbaracle, Golisopod, Araquanid, Xatu, Mandibuzz, Runerigus, Noivern, Vibrava, Flygon, Fracture, Haxorus, Sliggoo, Goodra, Toxicroak, Beware, Noctowl, Palpitoad, Seismitoad, Chargebug, Vikavolt, Lombre, Ludicolo, Abomasnow, Whimsicott, Ferrothorn, Golurk, Drifblim, Dusclops, Haunter, Musharna, Meowstic, Duosion, Reuniclus, Behem, Malamar, Mr. Rhyme, Jellicent, Doublade, Aegislash, Octillery, Kingler, Quagsire, Crustle, Cloyster, Glalie, Frostlass, Drapion, Weezing, Graplocked, Bronzong, Bisharp, Beartic, Avalugg, Crawdaunt, Ninjask, Shedinja, Lantern, Toxtricity, Wobbuffet, Hatchrim, Hatteran, Rapidash, Centiskorch, Salazzle, Lampent, Chandelure, Heliolisk, Charmeleon, Charizard, Sandaconda, Hippowdon, and Liepard. The remaining encounters required getting the Strawberry Sweet from the Battle Cafe, as well as playing with a bunch of Pokemon in camp to max out their happiness values. With this we can get Alchemy, Clefairy, Clefable, Swoobat, Roselia, Roserade, Togetic, Togekiss, Snorlax, Lucario, Espeon, Umbreon, Sylveon, and Frosmoth. Okay, if you were to take a guess how many Pokemon you think would be caught before the first badge, what would you say? 180? 200? 250? There are 289 Pokemon available in Shield before the first badge. Wanna know the crazy part? Sword has like 3 more because of version exclusives. Let's just move on to the next section. Now, as you'd expect, the gym for this section isn't going to be even relatively difficult, and realistically the only things that are going to be truly challenging are some of the raid battles we have to take on later throughout the challenge. After absolutely destroying Milo's team and collecting our first badge, we're able to head east of Turffield to access Route 5. After confronting Team Yell and saving this random old man, he'll give us the Rotom bike, which will dramatically speed up all of our future sections, especially when it comes to collecting experience candies for future evolutions. At the end of this route is Hulbury, where we meet up with Chairman Rose and Oleana, and she instructs us that we have to challenge gym leader Nessa in order to have our scheduled meetup with him at the restaurant. At this area in the game, we're not able to progress any further into new routes, as Team Yell isn't allowing anyone to enter the second Galar mine until more of the story events have been completed. I hate this game. Considering that the first two gyms are only separated by a single route, which includes Pokemon that we've already caught, you're probably thinking, well, I guess this section doesn't have any Pokemon then, so we can just take on Nessa, right? I think you know the right answer. For every gym badge that we collect, the level cap for catching Pokemon increases, as well as the star tiers that are available for max raid battles. With this in mind, we're able to catch Pokemon as high as level 25, but thankfully that doesn't unlock any new overworld Pokemon at this point, so the only thing we have to worry about are the new raid battles. Now that we've unlocked 2-star raids, we have another decent chunk to collect, and while this list isn't even half as long as the last section, you'll understand in a sec why this can still be a pain. In the rolling fields, we can catch Rhyhorn and Dreepy, Marini at East Axwell, Throw at North Lake Mylock, Cufant and Larvitar at the Giant Seat, Durant, Carablast and Indeedee in Bridgefield, Corsola in the Stony Wilderness, and Phalanx, Torkoal, and Heatmore in the Dusty Bowl. This brings our total to 302 Pokemon, which means that we have over 75% of the Galar Pokedex, which is actually a lot higher when you consider all the Pokemon we can't get because we're playing only one copy. Now it's time to evolve our catches. So obviously this section is incomparably easier to the first section of this challenge, but the two big roadblocks we have to take care of are going to be Larvitar and Dreepy. Each of them evolve at level 55 and 60 respectively, which means that we're going to need to collect a whole bunch of experience candies in order to make this happen. Fortunately, the 2-star raids give out significantly more experience than the 1-stars, as you get 5 small and 1 medium candy, which comes out to 7,000 XP per raid, or 11,600 if you complete one of the rare dens. You obviously still have a 50-50 chance of getting a 2-star raid appearing, but I'll gladly take that over getting a maximum of 2,300 like the last section. Just like last time, the rare candies have a 25% drop rate, which was basically only used on Larvitar and Dreepy because of their massive experience difference. After a few very lengthy raid grinding sessions, I was able to evolve my catches to get Rhydon, Dracloak, Dragapult, Toxapex, Copperajah, Pupitar, Tyranitar, and Cursula. This gives us a total of 310 Pokemon, and all the Pokemon that are available for the second badge. After challenging and defeating Nessa, we can meet up with Chairman Rose, Sonia, and Oleana at the restaurant, before finally gaining access to Galar Mine number 2. We immediately have a quick fight with Bede, before being able to sweep up the remaining Pokemon that we haven't already obtained. Here we can catch Shellos, Shuckle, and Stunfisk in the ground. Near the end of the mine, we have to take on more of Team Yell, and then meet up with Kabu, who tells us that he'll meet us at the gym whenever we're ready to take him on. This section is literally the same as the last one because we only get access to one new location. But once again, we do have a lot of new Pokemon available for us in the wild area. Unlike the last section, we've already collected all the raids that are available, which means that the rest of our encounters only require us to find them in the overworld or the grass, which is very relieving. Starting out in Bridgefield, we can catch Quillfish and Cramorant, Sigilyph in the Stony Wilderness, and Hawlucha, Maractus, and Vulpix at the Hammerlock Hills. This means that we only have 2 Pokemon left to evolve, which only one of them is through level up. After doing a whopping 3 raids, I was able to evolve my catches to get Gastrodon and Ninetales. This gives us a total of 321 Pokemon, and all the Pokemon available before the 3rd badge. Once we clear through Kabu's Fire Gym, we're finally able to access some new areas in the game. And additionally, we've unlocked 3-star raids, which give out a minimum 25,000 XP per raid, which will definitely make future grinding sessions ridiculously easy. Once we head out of Motostoke, we're instructed to head through the second section of the wild area and enter Hammerlock to take on more of the gym challenge. Upon arriving there, we meet up with Chairman Rose again, as well as meet the 8th gym leader Raihan, who instructs us to talk to Sonia to learn more about the history of the Galar legends. Once we finish with the required story stuff, we can talk to this boy who wants to know if we have an Applin. After he flexes our Pokemon that he didn't catch to win a girl's heart, he gives Applin back and we also receive the sweet apple. If we use this on Applin, it will evolve into Appleton. Heading west of Hammerlock, we reach Route 6, where we have to take on Team Yell, which is technically the last major story interaction for this section. As we traverse through the area, we can meet up with Caralis, who will revive those fossils that we collected earlier in the game from the digging duo. Here's a fun fact. It's pretty obvious that her name is based around the word careless in English, but in other languages, her name means things along the lines of being hasty or half-witted. Also, she's wearing two completely different shoes, so that would make sense as to why she has no idea what she's doing. With this, we can get Dracozolt, Arctozolt, Dracovish, and Arctovish. Once we reach Stowe inside, we completely demolish Hop in front of a whole city, and we're free to challenge the gym whenever we like. Before we do that, there are a couple more things that we have to do. If we go behind this building, we can collect the cracked pot, which if we use it on Sinistea, it will then evolve into Poltegeist. The last item that we have to collect for this area is the Razor Claw from the Merchant, which will help with the Pokemon that we've already collected. If you follow the path to the right of the gym, we're able to visit Glimwood Tangle, but we're blocked off by Team Yell until we can take on the gym leader. Fortunately, there is still a very small section of grass available to catch Pokemon, but all of the Pokemon's levels are on the border of our level cap, so your odds of encountering a catchable Pokemon is about a 50-50 shot. After a couple of failed attempts, we can catch a Rangaroo, which is the last Pokemon that's available in the newer routes. Since we now have access to 3-star raids, there's a small selection that's now available for us in the wild area. We can get Drampa in the Rolling Fields, Trevenant in Dappled Grove, Steelix and Aromatisse at the Bridge Field, Sableye in the Stony Wilderness, and Rotom at the Hammerlock Hills. The only Pokemon that we have to evolve is the Sneasel that we caught earlier. If you give it the Razor Claw and level it up during the nighttime, it will evolve into Weavile. This brings us to a total of 335 Pokemon, and all the Pokemon available before the 4th badge. Upon defeating Alistair, we chat with Sonia before challenging Bede, to only get immediately disqualified by Chairman Rose for trying to destroy the cave paintings to collect wishing stars. Before we progress any further through the story, it's important that we head back down to Route 6 to catch a Yamask, as we're going to need it in just a sec. Once it's all taken care of, we're now able to access the rest of Glimwood Tangle, where I probably broke the record for the fastest speedrun through the area. At the end of this area is Balonlee, which is the dead end for this section. If we head into the gym, we can talk to this trainer who is looking to trade a Unova Yamask for one of our Galarian forms. This is the only Pokemon that we have to evolve for this section, and because it's at a super high level when we get it, it only took a couple experience candies for it to evolve into Configregus. This gives us a total of 336 Pokemon before Gym 5, and a very surprising break after all that we've been through. Now that we can clear through Opal's gym, we can access another large chunk of the story, which will eventually lead to some new Pokemon to grab. Once we leave the gym, Opal will offer to take us to Hammerlock, where we meet up with Bede, and Opal then takes him under her wing. At this point, we're now allowed to head east of the city, where we'll now get access to the next few routes. On Route 7, we have another quick match with Hop, but we can also catch more Pico through the overworld encounters. As we make our way through Route 8, we can also grab Lunatone and Togedemaru in the Ruins section, before reaching Circhester, which is the location of the 6th gym leader. If we talk to this man at the ice cream stand, he'll ask if we have a Vanillish that we're willing to trade. You can actually grab one of these in the winter section of Route 8, so this trade is probably one of the most convenient ones in the entire game. With this, we can add Sock to the total. If we go to the far right side of the city, we can head south again to access Route 9. This marks the end of the section, as we're blocked off from the events of the bay, but we can still find Pincurchin at the grass at the beginning of the area. The final Pokemon for this section requires us to go all the way back to Hammerlock Hills. Now that we're able to capture Pokemon as high as level 45, we can head to the far right side of the area to catch Gourgeist. This gives us a total of 342 Pokemon, which is all that's available for this section. Now that we can check Melanie off the list of gym leaders to destroy, we can now meet up with Sonia and Hop at the restaurant, before once again fighting him in the middle of the city. Defeating the gym allows us to head further into Route 9, which leads us to another event with the Old Bike Guy and Team Yell. After clearing them out, we can now surf on the water, which gives us a pretty decent list of Pokemon to grab. Here we can get Wailmer, Mantike, and Lapras, which was another one of those Pokemon that just wouldn't appear like the Barboach did in Motostoke. Its encounter rate is only 1% through fishing, but I fished for over 2 hours and still didn't find it, so I relocated to the most southern spot in Circhester Bay, and I found it within 10 minutes. On the other side of Circhester Bay is the entrance to Spikemouth, but it's important to catch Delmise on the shore as it's not available anywhere else in the game aside from the 5-star raids. If we try and head into Spikemouth, Marnie challenges us to a battle before we can enter, and the only thing you can really do at this point is take on the gym. Before we do that, we're going to take on some new raids and some newly accessible locations. If we head all the way back to Professor Magnolia's house, we can use our new bike to surf on the water. If we fish here for a bit, we can encounter Feebas. Thankfully, we don't have to evolve it this time around. The remaining Pokemon are located in the wild area, and half of them are the new 4-star raids, but the other half are from the Lake of Outrage, which is the final wild area that we couldn't access before. With this, we can catch Gigalith, Machamp, Duraludon, and Ice-Q. During all of this, I carried Wailmer and Mantike in my party, which made it possible for them to evolve into Wailord and Mantine. This gives us a total of 353 Pokemon, and every Pokemon available before the 7th badge. Once we defeat Piers at Spikemuth, the game story is starting to build up to the big event. Because the majority of this section is based around story events, we once again only have one new Pokemon available to catch through the increased level cap. If we head into the Motostoke Riverbank, we can encounter Conkeldurr, which finishes off the section with 354 Pokemon. With Raihan finally defeated, we've completed the gym challenge, and the only parts that we have left to take on the story are the events in Winden. After battling a decent chunk of trainers on Route 10, we can enter the big city and head to Winden Stadium to register for the Galar Pokemon Tournament. Before we do that, let's take care of a couple new encounters. With all 8 badges under our belt, we're able to catch Pokemon of any level, as well as encounter 5-star raids throughout the entire wild area. For now, we're just going to collect the overworld encounters, and then we'll come back later to take care of all the dens at the end of the section. In the Stony Wilderness, we can catch Dusknoir, and within the Giant's Cap, we can capture Gengar, which brings us to 356 Pokemon. Heading back to Winden, we take on Marnie and Hop at the tournament, before heading back to the hotel to rest up for the final matches. We then meet up with Oleana while we're looking for Leon, and we store in the Macros Cosmos building in order to get to the top to make sure that he's okay. Once we defeat Oleana and bring him back home, we're forwarded to the next day to the tournament. Once Bede, Nessa, Alistair, and Raihan have been demolished, our final battle with Leon is interrupted by Chairman Rose as he initiates the Darkest Day. Once we meet up with Hop and Sonia at the Slumbering Wheel to collect the rusted sword and shield, we head back to Hammerlock to put the battle with Rose to an end. When we take the elevator to the top of the power plant, we discover that he summoned Eternatus, and now it's our job to defeat it by ourselves. Once Zacian and Zamazenta come to our rescue, we're able to take it down, and with a single Pokeball, we can add Eternatus to the total. From here, the game brings you back to the inn, and you're supposed to take on Leon to complete the game. But there are still a few more Pokemon that we have to pick up. Our final trip to the wild area requires us to catch a few raid-exclusive Pokemon, and since they're all 5-star raids, they're actually pretty difficult to take down if you don't have the right type matchups. With this, we can catch Milotic, Aselgor, Rhyperior, and Mimikyu to the total, which gives us 361 Pokemon in the Galar Pokedex. But just like every other video, we're not done with the challenge. We still have to take on the postgame. With our super team of overpowered Pokemon, we defeat Leon and are crowned the new champion of the region. Once we start the game back up, we're immediately greeted by Professor Magnolia, who gives us the Master Ball, which doesn't really have any importance in this point in the game, considering that we're missing a whopping 39 Pokemon from completing the entirety of the Galar Pokedex. Before we really get into anything, we're going to fly back to Winden, and more importantly, the new Battle Tower. If you go inside, there will be a trainer there that will gift you Type Null, which is a great Pokemon to get early on because it evolves through happiness. If we head back to the Slumbering Wheel, we can battle Hop and return the Rusted Sword and Shield, which begins the post-game that has to be completed. I'm sure most of you know the story by now, as it's a very straightforward post-game. So after about 40 minutes of gym raid battles, we meet them back at the power plant. After defeating them, Zacian tries to attack them, only for Zamazenta to scare him off. For here, we're able to battle Zamazenta, and because we have that Master Ball, this is a super easy Pokemon to add to the total. This is the last Pokemon that we had to catch for this section, which means that the only Pokemon that we have to take care of now is Type Null. After cooking a very unhealthy amount of curry to increase its happiness, it evolved into Silvally. This brings the total to 364 Pokemon, and all the Pokemon available in one copy of Pokemon Shield. And with that, we've successfully completed Professor Oak's challenge in Pokemon Sword and Shield. But how did I do? So let's review. Once I evolved the final Pokemon, I finished with a time of 92 hours and 8 minutes, which is honestly a lot less time than I initially would have expected. It probably comes as no surprise that the first section takes up a majority of this time, and although it seems like this is probably a really tedious challenge, it didn't really feel like it because of how much movement goes into it. Normally you'd be biking left and right and pressing A for hours, but this is definitely a more engaging type of challenge, which made it a lot more fun than most of the other challenges that I've had to face. Just like any of the other challenges, if you're interested in taking on the challenge for yourself, I've linked the spreadsheet as well as Sean's guide in the description to help you on your journey. If you end up trying it out for yourself, tweet me your progress at Johnstone YT. Other than that, that's all there is to say about completing Professor Oak's challenge in Pokemon Sword and Shield. And that's going to do it for today's video. If you liked the video, leave a like and consider subscribing, as I'll be making more content like this very soon. If you have any other suggestions for videos that you'd like to see, leave a comment below. Follow me on Twitter to keep updated with new videos as they come out. Other than that, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.